episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. I'm your host, Amy Killingsworth, and today we are talking about pillar number 6 in the Rise to Reign framework, vulnerability. So I have to make a confession. If you've been with me all the way through, you might notice that vulnerability wasn't in the original 7 of the Rise to Reign principles. I actually replaced community with vulnerability, and I did it because of this experience that I'm getting ready to talk about right now. So I always feel about myself and my life that I'm sort of a archetypical, like, prophetic figure. I get to go through things and have experiences so that I have material to teach you guys. So you're welcome, because the things that I go through sometimes are very, very uncomfortable and sometimes really, really painful. So it's all worth it, though, because it's part of God's plan to help me fulfill my call in bringing this information and this framework to you so that you can be healed, so that you can wholeheartedly live your purpose and live your life. So without further ado, let's talk about vulnerability. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about what it is. But first, I want to tell you the pillar that I replaced vulnerability with was community. So there's 7 pillars and 7 categories with Rise to Reign. And one of the categories is actually relationships. So as I was looking at this and trying to find a place to fit vulnerability in, because I knew it was really, really important to the framework of emotional healing, I noticed that relationships and community had a ton of overlap. So I'm going to handle the community piece in the relationships category. So Rise to Reign is 7 pillars of wisdom applied to the 7 categories of our life. So review. The 7 pillars are identity, sovereignty, consent, amnesty, which is a broad spectrum of forgiveness, integrity, polarity, which is masculinity and femininity, vulnerability, and generosity. And then the 7 categories are body, mind, which is like the mind, will, and emotions, so soul, spirit, relationships, finances, creativity, and calling. So we take the 7 pillars and apply them to the 7 categories. So what does it look like to have bodily sovereignty, for instance, would be one way that we apply the pillar of sovereignty to our physical health. So the idea of vulnerability was so important that I took out the community pillar and replaced it with vulnerability. And the reason I did that is because I had an experience that kind of like just rocked my world a little bit, rocked my emotional world, I should say. So without getting into a lot of detail, what happened was I was having a conversation with someone and they said something that I was not expecting. It came out of left field for me and I wasn't expecting to hear it. So as a coach and as a consultant, I have a skill that I've developed that when people say things that shock me, sometimes appall and horrify me, I can't react to it. You know, like if somebody tells me something really vulnerable or they feel exposed, I can't be like, you know. So I've developed that skill, and I think it's a really, really good skill professionally for putting people at ease so that they feel safe in a coaching relationship. But I went into that space in a personal situation. And what I ended up doing was, instead of reacting the way that I was feeling, I just I went into self-defense. I completely armored up and shut down and came out of my core and up to the surface. So if you've ever been to Rise to Reign Live, or if you ever come to it in the future, I talk about how most of our communication and our relationships kind of happen up here. And it's like, hey, how's it going? You know, how are your kids, or how's work? And you have this sort of surface level communication. And that is not true connection. True connection is when you you crack yourself open and you show inside of you, and the other person is the same, and you connect. And so what I did in this situation is, the opposite of that. I slammed every door shut and just sat there and kind of made small talk. And inside I was just reeling, but on the outside, I was just like, flippant and like, whatever, you can't, it doesn't get to me, it doesn't bother me. So I walked away from that situation and I was so bothered by it, not necessarily by what was said, although I didn't like that one bit. I didn't like what was said one bit. Not only did I not like it, but in the context, I was not expecting it. And so I was even a little bit like, maybe a little, if I'm telling the truth, I was maybe even a little mad about it, because it seemed out of place in the context that it was in. But it wasn't really so much about what was said, rather than my own reaction to it and really being out of integrity. And so I covered integrity in the last episode, and you're going to see how integrity and vulnerability really, really go together. But they're different, but you need both. So in order to talk about vulnerability, I'm going to get into it in just a minute. But before I do, I have to talk about emotional addiction, primary wound, and source belief. So this needs its own episode, and it's really, really important. I actually have it on the schedule to do it this fall. So this is not going to do it justice, but I have to use this to be able to really explain this concept and how it works. So we all have an emotional addiction, and it's a place that we go automatically when we feel hurt, when we feel threatened, when we are confronted with something that's uncomfortable. It's a place we automatically go. So you can very easily define what your emotional addiction is generally by just seeing, like, think about the last time you were triggered, like the last time that you felt uncomfortable by something that was said or done. Where do you go? Do you get mad? Do you go to, like to disappointment? Do you feel sorry for yourself? That's kind of, it's like it's your place that you sort of hang out emotionally. And it takes self-awareness. It takes cultivating self-awareness to realize what that is. But the emotional addiction, and you might say, like, emotional addiction, like that anger feels bad, and, disappointment feels bad, and self-pity feels really bad. And you're right, but we still get addicted to it because it becomes exciting to our nervous system. So this is kind of a whacked out way of us feeling safe from our past. So we develop our emotional addictions in childhood, and because it feels familiar, even though it doesn't feel good, it feels familiar. And so you tend to go there and hang out there and become addicted to that chemical. So how many of you know, like, I kind of lived through this in my childhood, in my teen years, and in my early 20s. You can become addicted to chaos. You can become addicted to drama. And how many of you know somebody that's addicted to drama? Like, they can't just be at peace. They can't just let things be calm. And, they're always just stirring something up, or they make things harder than they have to be. And that's because they have an addiction to drama, because they probably grew up in a chaotic household and were subjected, their nervous system was constantly subjected to the biophysical reality of that emotion. And so they became addicted to it, even though it doesn't feel good. So sometimes when we think about addiction, it's like, oh, it's, addiction to pornography, or it's addiction to food, or it's addiction to alcohol, or something that provides pleasure. But when we talk about an emotional addiction, it doesn't necessarily provide pleasure. It's usually really, really painful, but it's something where your nervous system feels at home in. I hope that is making sense. So the emotional addiction stems from a primary wound. So we all have a primary wound. You can have multiple wounds, but we all have a primary wound. And a primary wound is the thing that happened in such a repetitive motion, or a message that we received so repetitively that it really anchored into our subconscious and was a wound. It can be something, it doesn't have to be repetitive. It can be something like so profound. Like if your dad walks out when you are 2 or 3 and, your mother struggles to survive, that's going to create a primary wound of abandonment, obviously. But if you, like I did, had a dad who was so emotionally unavailable and really angry, that also created a wound of abandonment because there wasn't anything there. His body was there, but there wasn't really anything there for me. So I constantly felt abandoned. And then in my teen years, and life tends to like reinforce these wounds. That's part of the strategy of the enemy is like it will have a message. Your John Eldridge calls it the message of the arrows. Your core wounding will have a pattern to it, and your life will sort of work to reinforce this wounding. And that happens for a couple reasons, because I feel like there are forces at play that perpetuate that, but also when you have that, when the core wound creates the emotional addiction and you're addicted to that emotion, you kind of create the situations and you attract them to reinforce the primary wound. So there's the core wound in the emotional addiction, and then the core wound is attached to a source belief. So the wound is something that happened that hurt you. The source belief is the meaning that you gave it, or the agreement that you made because of it. So I'll give you an example of mine without going into a lot of detail, and I will go into detail, but in another episode, because this one's about vulnerability, but you have to understand this so that you can understand that. So my emotional addiction was feeling disappointed with maybe a side of self-pity. Okay, so that is something that I, thankfully, at my age, I'm 46 years old, and I've done years and years and years of self-awareness and emotional healing work. But I still battle it, right? Like, it's still, when something really hits me hard, that's where I go. And I know that I go there, and that's the key, is like when you see the pattern begins to dissolve. But I can kind of like pull myself out of it, but I still go there. So my emotional addiction was feeling disappointed or let down, and a little side of self-pity. So the primary wound is abandonment, and my source belief, which is always a lie, by the way. There's never a source belief that is healthy and empowering. But the source belief is I can't depend on anyone, or everyone will always let me down. No one's going to come through for me. So that's kind of the cocktail of the source belief. So in this situation, what happened was I had some information come at me from left field. And two things were going on. One was like, why, it rattled me. I went into defense, and then my mind was like, why do you care? Because it wasn't somebody that I know well. It wasn't like, it didn't really affect me that much, but it really affected me for whatever reason. And I wasn't honest about that. I was like, oh, okay, that's nice. I totally went into like self-protective mode. And so vulnerability is the opposite of that. Like, I armored up emotionally. It's like, you can't hurt me. Like, I'm not going to let that in because I don't like the way that feels. So you armor up, and then you basically are living a lie at that point. So vulnerability defined, and I'm using the work of Brene Brown here, is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's that unstable feeling we get when we step out of our comfort zone or do something that forces us to loosen control. So in that moment, if I had, instead of going into self-defense and becoming armored up, if I had said, I had some questions, honestly, like, what the heck questions, like, I'm like, what, I needed to say what was true, what I was feeling, and ask some questions and get some clarity on a few things. And I didn't. I was like, oh no, yeah, that's fine. That's okay. It wasn't fine. I wasn't fine. And instead of being authentic about that, I was just like flippant, and armored up about it. So the other thing, the follow-on that Brene Brown says is vulnerability is not weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage. So when I walked away from this situation, not only did I feel, kind of rattled and disappointed by that information that I received. But I was also really disappointed in myself. So you can see like the kind of the ping pong of the emotional addiction is like I was really disappointed in myself because I'm like, I teach this stuff, like what am I doing on the stage and having a podcast and coaching people? Like I'm not even, I don't even follow my own rules, like so there was all this like shame spiral and self-recrimination. Because vulnerability is not weakness, it's our most accurate measure of courage. Because going into defense and putting armor up, that's not strength. That is weakness. And it takes strength and it takes knowing who you are to keep your heart open, even when it's breaking, even when you're threatened. So the opposite, I like to always try to understand something when I'm really trying to understand and wrestling with a concept. I like to understand it, define it by its opposite. So the opposite of vulnerability is what I would call defensiveness. It's like going into a place of defensiveness. And it's like that attitude, like, I don't care. Like, whatever. Like, do whatever. I don't care. Or it's active attack. Like it can be like attack back. And in the integrity episode, I talked about the dynamic in male-female relationships that happens a lot, which is the silent treatment. That's defensiveness. That is defensiveness on display. Instead of, it's obviously not telling the truth, but it's like that punishment. Like the silent treatment is a form of punishment. Or passive aggressiveness. So you like start slamming doors, or you start like forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning, or forgetting to, whatever, like, oops, and you're actually passive aggressively punishing somebody because they hurt you, instead of handling it head on and being like, hey, what you said hurt my feelings. Like I feel hurt, not blaming, but saying, like this how I was affected by that. And then asking for what you need. That's vulnerability. Saying, this is how what happened and what you did or what you said affected me. And this is what I need to be okay. This is what I need to get back to level, and asking for it. And the other person obviously is free to provide that or not providing that, but you have to be vulnerable to even ask for what you need. And what we have is a lot of people running around without their needs met. And addiction is not emotional addiction necessarily, but like hard addictions, like pornography and alcohol and drugs and sex, and maybe like softer addictions like social media and shopping, so-called. I feel like those are pretty detrimental. But you have a lot of people with addictions. It's a major problem. And what addiction is getting a legitimate need met in an illegitimate way. And the reason that people are drawn to getting their needs met illegitimately is because they're not being vulnerable and asking for what they need, typically in relationships, because that requires vulnerability. So the opposite of vulnerability is defensiveness. And so what does defensiveness look like? Well, it's to withdraw. It's to close down and pull behind a protective shield. And that's exactly what I did. And if anybody knows me in my real life, I am an absolute open book. I cry at the drop of a hat. I wear my feelings on my sleeve. I am not a closed off defensive person. And so for me to go into like that withdrawal and close down, I'm still like friendly, but my heart is now behind a wall. Like my true self is now behind a wall, and I'm bringing my false self and I'm bringing my representative to the conversation now, because Amy, like real, true, honest, authentic Amy, has left the building because she got scared. So she's like, whoop, I'm out. And here comes the princess, right? Here comes the slave. Here comes the prisoner to represent, because the queen hit the road because she got rattled or scared. So withdrawing, closed down, pulling behind a protective shield is the opposite of vulnerability, which I call defensiveness. Defensiveness hides problems. It doesn't fix them. So remember that feelings buried alive never die. And it locks the toxic tank shut. And what's in there, which is, the feelings buried alive and the trauma and the things in your nervous system that are unpleasant only get worse. It festers and it rots. And you think you're keeping the hurt out, but really what you're doing is you're locking it in. When you build walls and when you put armor on, you think that you're keeping other people out. You think you're keeping yourself safe from other people. But what you are really doing is you are keeping yourself behind that wall, and you're keeping yourself in a prison, really. So we talk about the prisoner as an archetype of the lower self, or the false self. And this is a big part of that, is when you build the walls, you really like wall that prisoner person into the prison. You create the prison. You are the architect of the prison. So defenses are armor we use to keep ourselves safe, we think. Now, I think it's so funny because I was actually listening to one of my podcasts the other day, and it was the song that I play, Unstoppable, and she says, I put my armor on, da 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 da, and I'm like, oh, maybe that's not the best lyric for the message that I want to convey. I love what it comes after it is like, I'm unstoppable. But especially as women, we're unstoppable when we are open and when we are undefended. The undefended queen is maybe the most powerful force in the universe, because she's open and she's secure. She knows who she is, and she can hurt. Like we can hurt. We can experience pain, but we don't have to suffer. So the suffering comes from the meaning that we give the pain, or we give the catalyzing event. And the other thing that we can do is we can hurt and experience pain and do our emotional hygiene and tell the truth and do our forgiveness, and not create a malignancy out of that pain. And the way that we do that is by staying undefended or being vulnerable. So we defend active wounds, and we defend the primary wound furiously. So when you go into defense, you're defending an active wound. So when you have a wound that's completely healed, you don't feel the necessity to defend it anymore. So when we're talking about a primary wound of mine, which was, maybe is abandonment, this situation was like, whoa, like it was so much self-awareness that like, I still have work to do here. And I shouldn't be surprised, because I teach this, like you'll always be doing this work of emotional healing for the rest of your life. And even if you get to a place where maybe you've mostly healed what is in the central nervous system and the toxic tank, you still are you're still going to be doing your emotional hygiene, because you're going to come into situations that are painful. Life is hard, like life is challenging. So people hurt you, people die, people let you down. So you have to be able to approach life with an open heart and do your emotional hygiene, so that you don't continue to anchor in your patterns. But in this situation that I'm talking about, I can tell you by my reaction that the circumstance, although triggering, was really triggering something from the past. I know to the level of which I reacted to it, it gave me some self-awareness on some other stuff too, about how I really felt about this person in this situation, the level of emotional energy around my response. But it also gave me some self-awareness about the fact that I needed to pay attention. Maybe some more healing was necessary. So when we go into defensiveness, we actually create what we defend against. And this is what satisfies our emotional addiction. So let me show you how this works, okay? So in this situation, if my primary wound is people are going to let me down, people are going to disappoint me, abandonment. That's my source belief and my primary wound. My primary wound is abandonment. My source belief is people can't be trusted. Nobody's going to come through for me. People will always let me down. And so I receive a bit of information that is uncomfortable, and I close down and go into self-defense and don't show my true self. I had just abandoned myself. And how can anybody else show up for me if I'm not showing up for me? They can't. And so that reinforces the emotional addiction of feeling disappointed, and it reinforces a source belief that nobody's going to come through for me, because if I won't come through for me, then nobody's going to come through for me. And we initiate really an internal war that we can't win. And the solution to it is to intentionally choose vulnerability. So vulnerability is letting our guard down and taking our armor off. It's an open-hearted response to hurt, and it's a choice to keep our heart open even if it's breaking. Even if we're in pain, we can still keep our heart open. And we do this because we know who we are. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So what did I do in this situation? Well, first of all, I was talking to a really close friend of mine that knows my work really well. She actually works with me. And, I'm like, it's just, I couldn't get past it. And she kind of confronted me a little bit, and she's like, I think you're really upset, not about necessarily the situation, but what about that you weren't true to yourself, that you weren't, that you didn't show up the way that you tell people to show up. And I was like, busted. That broke it open for me. So much so that I had to go back and clean this situation up for my own integrity. I had to go back and really humble myself and say, hey, I played it cool in that situation, but I felt anything but cool. And here's what I really felt, and here's what I really think, and with the benefit, because I had a little processing to do. When something catches you off guard, you can't necessarily access oh, here's how I feel about this, or here's what's going on inside of me. I had the benefit of processing, and men need this even more than women, is that time to take and process. But I was able to come to a place of clarity, and with emotional intelligence, I was able to take my armor off, open my heart, and be like, here's what's true. Here's what's true. So vulnerability is required to tell the truth without manipulation. And I said it was the last episode. It wasn't. It was the last episode I listened to. It wasn't the last episode you listened to. So episode number 8 is integrity, where I talked about living in the light of truth. And in order to live in the light of truth, a prerequisite to integrity is vulnerability. You have to make yourself vulnerable to be able to tell the truth without manipulation, because really, defensiveness is a mechanism of control. It's a mechanism of trying to control your environment and control people around you's reaction so that you can be okay. It's really codependency. It's like an outworking of a type of codependency. So vulnerability is required. It's a prerequisite to tell the truth without manipulation. And vulnerability requires that you know who you are and you're not diminished by someone else's choices or opinions, and that speaks to identity. So when I was, cleaning up this issue, it was really hard for me because I don't know, I didn't know this person really well, and they definitely don't know me very well. And so there's all this this is crazy. Am I, what are they going to think, and how are they going to respond? And I know that when I'm in that realm of thinking about what their response is going to be, I'm away from the truth and in manipulation. I have to just constantly pull myself back into the place of clarity and telling the truth without manipulation and letting their reaction be what it is. We have to, guys, we have to set people free from managing our emotional states. If you want to be in relationship with people, if you want to work with people or live alongside people, you have to set other people free from the responsibility of making you okay inside. So that's what I did, is I just said, here's the actual, honest, undefended truth. There it is. Do with it what you will. You're free. You don't have to respond. You don't have to respond in a certain way. It's this is just what it is. And so you can only do that if you know who you are and that you're not diminished by someone else's choices or opinions. Because listen to me when I say that other people's stuff has nothing to do with you. It really, really, really doesn't. Like, even when somebody treats you badly, it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with what's going on inside of them and their emotional patterning and what's going on inside of their heart and life and mind. It has absolutely nothing to do. It's said that I've heard this said over and over again. It's like people's opinion of you is none of your business. And so if you're trying to constantly be on like a PR campaign and make sure that everybody thinks that you're cool and awesome and whatever, you're going to live a really false life. That's the princess or the prince. And so to come to this place of feeling at home in your own skin and feeling emotionally free, being emotionally free, you have to let go of what other people are going to think of you and just tell the truth without manipulation. It's really, really, really important. Vulnerability is also required for true connection. So if you're in that place where you're sending your representative and your representative is interacting with this person, you're not connecting, because you have to be down here. You can't be up here to connect. You have to be down here to connect. You have to show up as your authentic self, and they have to show up as their authentic self. And that's where true, honest intimacy and connection happens. I'm going to say this. Vulnerability is a very feminine quality. So being vulnerable, being open is a very feminine quality. However, we mentioned like men have to access feminine qualities to be in relationships. So men have to cultivate vulnerability as well and use it in appropriate times. It's harder, I think, maybe for them, but it's hard for us too. Like vulnerability it's just hard, but it's so, so, so worth it. Vulnerability also requires you to surrender and give up control of people and situations. I already talked about setting people free. Okay, so I'm going to wrap vulnerability up with this. What's the difference between, like it says in Proverbs, guard your heart. So I'm saying like keep your heart open. Well, can you keep your heart open and guard it at the same time? Guarding your heart is different than armor. Okay, and guarding your heart has to do with not people's thoughts and not people's opinions, but people's choices and behaviors that hurt you. Okay? So somebody speaks to me in a tone or in a way that diminishes me, I'm going to set a boundary and I'm going to be like, no, you can't talk to me that way or I'll leave. If somebody does something or chooses something that hurts me, I can set a boundary on that behavior and be like, I won't tolerate that, but I don't close my heart. Okay. So when you close your heart and send your representative, that is trying to manipulate somebody else's thoughts, feelings, or opinions where you're concerned. When you set a boundary, you're guarding your heart from hurt by saying your behavior isn't going to fly with me. That's not acceptable. You set boundaries from an undefended place, and boundaries actually create the culture of safety so that your heart can stay open. And it's really, really, really important to have an open heart because that's where you feel from. That's where you love from. That's where you connect from. So if you're used to going into defense, and if you're used to shutting down, and if you're used to sending your false self and your representative, I just want to challenge you to start practicing in context, start practicing vulnerability and seeing how it changes your life and changes your relationships. All right, my friends, that is it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. And remember, God wants you healed so you can wholeheartedly live your purpose and love your life. I'll see you next time.